walls of the corridor are set with sconces. Take a torch to light your journey into the underbelly of the building. You descend the spiral stone steps into the cold, rank basement. When you light the torches on the walls, you illuminate numerous strange artifacts. You realize you are surrounded by instruments of pain. You have entered the torture chamber. The dungeon is outfitted to be an interrogation room straight out of early modern Germany. You are met by the formidable height of the rack, a frame with a pulley system for suspending the accused, often with weight attached to their legs. Of course, there are thumb screws and boots for compressing the extremities. They are all labeled with plaques indicating their grisly purpose. Your museum guidebook says, historian Lyndall Roper places the total number of witchcraft executions in Europe at upwards of 50,000, with about half of those located in the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire. The witch hunts gained momentum in the second half of the 16th century and were followed by another wave in the early 17th century. During this era of paranoia, many innocents were sacrificed on the pyres. What could have possessed entire communities to turn on their neighbors? What could have sparked such widespread brutality? Did they really believe Jane from down the street cavorted with the devil? Or were there other motivating factors to the accusations? The psychology of the witch craze can only be speculative, but scholars can make reasonable inferences based on cultural, historical knowledge, trial transcripts, writing, and art, societal fears of women's sexuality and autonomy, the precariousness of securing the next generation, exacerbated by factors of natural disaster, like the ergot hypothesis, a hallucinogenic fungus that infected grain crops, which could potentially be the source of certain delusions and convulsions. Reactions to cultural deviance and political dissidence, and the ever-shifting landscape of religion and politics, these all may have contributed to these panics. A room with instruments like these is where the accused would have spent hours being interrogated. Those unfortunate enough to find themselves accused of witchcraft knew generally what to anticipate. These procedures were commonplace during the thousands of trials. Nonetheless, the psychological and physical torture inflicted upon people so that they would confess cannot be understated. Sometimes an accused witch would be interrogated for weeks or even months on end before he or she finally confessed, a drawn-out ordeal which made the person's last days a living hell. For many, the gallows or the stake was a mercy. And yet, however despicable and unfathomable it may seem, the interrogators and numerous accusers were not all just monsters. They were human beings who oftentimes truly believed in the morality of their actions. Many earnestly thought that making the witch confess was the only way to save her soul from Satan's grasp. In the center of the room stands a memorial to the innocents who lost their lives in these panics. It is a commanding bronze statue of a woman standing with her hands bound around a stake, which poignantly captures the final moments of one doomed to death in the flames. The room is also filled with the iconography of the witch craze, replicas of illustrated treatises, woodcuts, sensational prints, and paintings. These works were often inspired by the frenzy of the time, and they in turn must have continued to fuel the fire, perpetuating that enduring cultural cycle which media often does. First displayed are Albrecht Dürer's prints, which are some of the most famous images from the European witch craze. Then we have numerous works by his pupil, Hans Baldung Grien, an educated German artist active in the early 16th century. On the walls you can see the development of printmaking technology from woodcuts to copper etchings. According to historian Diana Petherbridge, it is through printmaking that witches and the information about witches has been distributed, especially through illustrated Bibles and other texts initially. Hans Baldung Grien's 1510 woodcut Witches' Sabbath shocks right from the start with its lurid depiction of nude witches brewing up a storm in a cauldron. Grien fills every inch of this piece with chaos, the movement of the witches as well as an abundance of talismanic objects consuming the panel. Thus, the high level of contrast in the woodcut is all that allows the viewer to truly distinguish what is going on. The thick, choking plume of smoke evacuating the pot is perhaps the most well-placed compositional element, as it breaks up the illustration and creates a large sweeping line which draws the eye to the upper part. On the other side, a tree trunk performs a similar segmenting and directing function, lending this busy piece some form. Many little details can be found, including what appear to be smoking sausages near the cauldron. Rude imagery and phallic symbols are very common in these types of prints, indicating a more tongue-in-cheek attitude, as opposed to the somewhat darker imagery on display during the peak of witch executions later on in the 17th century. As with virtually all art of the witch craze, Grien holds nothing back in his portrayal of extreme feminine evil, pulling out all the stops to moralize and yet also to utterly titillate the viewer. And like many other artists, Grien also compares the bodies of women in various stages of their life cycles, crudely commenting on aging bodies and souring fertility, and the correspondingly increasing threat of a woman's sexuality. Baldung Grien's work develops witch iconography into more of a Renaissance style, with greater detail and anatomical accuracy. Images and art of witchcraft began to emerge in the late 15th century, early 16th century, corresponding with the historical circumstance which you can surely guess, an increasing artistic culture and an increasing theological and demonological fixation on witchcraft. However, interestingly, actual persecutions of alleged witches did not hit a fever pitch until the second half of the 1500s. The lull in the witch craze at the time when Grien was putting out these works seems to suggest that they were not actually functional propaganda and had little impact on the historical circumstances, at least until after his death. More than anything, Dürer and Grien represent a transitional period in Renaissance art. As artistic practices change and develop, so too do depictions of witchcraft shift from more practical, crude illustrations, see the De la Mise treatise, and woodcuts, to more artistic and complex etchings and other types of prints, illustrations, and later paintings. Baldung Grien's work comes less than 30 years after the publication of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, the perhaps overanalyzed definitive guidebook for witch hunters, published by Springer and Kramer in 1492. So the misogynistic and deeply fearful attitudes present in the Malleus would have been the air he and his mentor Dürer breathed. Grien's work is often included alongside scholarship about the witch craze. Most often it is taken at face value, as proof of the wacky beliefs of those silly early modern peasants, but seldom analyzed as art unto its own. Grien's illustrations were not the pop iconography fueling mass hysteria that one might assume based on existing scholarship, in which they are mentioned tangentially, taken for granted as simple visual evidence of superstitions. In reality, it is hard to take these pieces as evidence of specific beliefs about witchcraft, because Grien could have had any number of motives for depicting certain subject matter. Perhaps it was just him being imaginative and expressive. Furthermore, these prints were intended for a specific audience, namely Grien's social circle of intellectuals and professionals. They are more likely read as private jokes than propaganda. These works are a glimpse into the private lives of this social strata, while the fire of the witch craze was indeed beginning to blaze through the 1500s Rhineland. And it seems that while we may never know if Baldung Grien and his ilk truly believed in witches, they certainly participated in the heavily misogynistic talking points of their day about what made women susceptible to witchcraft. Grien's 1514 ink sketches Three Witches, New Year's Sheet, Witch and Demon, and The Witch's Sabbath are also on display beside the woodcut, all of which share a raw sexuality. Three Witches, with its contorted poses and even a potential image of self-pleasure, demonstrates a cheeky licentiousness, not intended for the public, but rather for a private recipient, a cleric no less, if the inscription is to be believed. This work also draws attention to women's infertile bodies, driving home the connection between witch persecution and fears about fertility and female sexuality. Oddly enough, the specific powers of witches were more hotly debated than their existence. Many theological and intellectual authorities posed that the folkloric belief in the witch's Sabbath was not literally true. Of course, these women could not fly away to remote locations to take part in such dark, inverted rituals filled with cannibalism and infanticide, but they did suffer the delusion that this was taking place, and they really were influenced by the devil and demonic forces. Baldung Grien mocks the folly of these women, implying that they are imagining the flight and the Sabbath, potentially under the influence of some imbibed substance. But though he may not believe they can fly, he has no sympathy for these women, who, old or young, are lustful and weak-willed vessels of evil. The way these women are passed out on the floor implies that their flight is a dream, a fantasy. But in the words of Linda Holtz, he cast doubt on the reality of the witch's power without relinquishing his sense of their profound evil. Classic tropes of witchcraft, cannibalism, or at least the implication of cannibal-like behavior, and infanticide. The violent cannibalistic elements are present in Grien's work, as you can see here. But this can be seen even more clearly in other works. The witch as cannibal bears resemblance to both colonial depictions of indigenous cannibalism in the New World and blood libel myths about Jews. However, this particular iconography suggests that the threat of witchcraft through the 16th and 17th centuries is associated less with external forces than with a threat experienced as internal within society in general and within particular individuals. And those individuals are, in this case, uncontrolled women. As you continue to move among the art, you notice a particularly striking painting. It seems to be an evolution and expansion of those images shown in the earlier prints. It is a beautiful, busy, and sophisticated piece that makes your skin crawl as you step closer. You look at your museum guidebook. Even as art was developing, we tend to think of the Renaissance as a time of progress rather than of superstition. The witch craze became more intense. Numerous witch trials took place in the 1600s. Although these events are not the most popular subject in the fine art of the era, they were still present. Italian artist Salvatore Rosa's painting, Witches at Their Incantations, from about 1646, is a full display of advanced Renaissance painting techniques with a subject matter rooted in ancient superstitions. This is a very gripping painting, with so much intrigue and inventiveness. There is a lot to unpack and observe, as it is loaded with hidden figures and shadowy details that only reveal themselves to those who stare into its maw. The dark machinations of witchery bubble up in various esoteric symbols and rituals. One coven member can be seen harvesting the toenails of a hanged criminal, presumably for some kind of potion or spell. It uses a very dark, rich color palette, and the flesh tones are especially well blended, which, along with the contrast against the dark background, really draws the eye to the most central figure in the bottom middle of the canvas. She is our gateway into this world, a withered old crone with asymmetrical breasts drooping over her cauldron, and the human bone she clutches. And now you walk from the Renaissance into the Baroque Enlightenment era. In the next room, you are met with displays of Francisco de Goya's Uncanny Witches. This exhibit is accompanied by a three-dimensional mobile hanging from the ceiling. It has a shadowy presence, a symbol of all that was lurking in Goya's mind as he produced these dark works. The mobile takes the form of Goya's rendition of the three fates of Greek myth, dangling and swirling around your head, wreaking their havoc, sealing your fate with their yarn and shears. The yarn they weave dangles, ensnaring unsuspecting victims. Their forms are lumpy, deformed, and androgynous. Of course, the hall includes plaques with historical background written on them. Goya's Los Caprichos are a series of aquatint printed copper etchings, which were initially released in 1799. The series was made as a satire of Spanish society, particularly mocking the nobility and clergy. In a time when virtually no witch trials persisted, Goya's depictions of witchcraft and witchy themes are especially arresting. Goya's are the quintessential witches, an embodiment of many cliches, often used as a way to comment on society. For instance, the folly of superstition and backwardness, or corruption in the church. Witches are seen flying on broomsticks, such as in the 68th Capriccio, which depicts two nude women, one old and one young, straddled over a broomstick. Not only is Goya engaging in the fascination with women's aging bodies by contrasting the voluptuous young witch and withered old crone, but he also plays into the belief that witchcraft spread via coercion by old women. Connected to the old procuress trope It was often claimed that an old woman would initiate a young witch by conducting a dark transaction with the devil and selling the young woman's maidenhead. Thus, the blame typically transferred to the old woman, who was more of a societal pariah, as she is past childbearing age. However, in Goya's case, the older witch indoctrinating the younger could have a different symbolic meaning, attached to Spanish authorities or clergy. Goya also illustrates witches consuming human flesh, even infant flesh, as in Capriccio No. 45, which has witches preparing their meal, a basket of dead babies. Goya also touches on themes of luring and killing men, use of familiars, use of macabre ritual objects and talismans, conspiratorial groups of older women, and sexuality in his witch etchings. Unlike early modern artists such as Grien, Goya, a man of the Enlightenment, held no real belief in witches. His depictions are purely metaphoric or satiric in nature. And while Goya's work does play into extant biases about women, in some of his archetypal witch depictions, his representation of witchcraft is, as I have said, more complex than that. In addition to using witchy figures to parody government nobles and clergy, he also portrayed themes of witchcraft in a deeply raw and emotional way, an expression of his inner demons. Take, for instance, Goya's paintings about witches' sabbaths. Witches' Sabbath from 1798 is from a lot earlier in his life, and Witches' Sabbath, the Great He-Goat, from about 1821 to 1823, one of Goya's infamous end-of-life black paintings, as you can see, is much darker. However, they both depict anthropomorphized goats as the leader of a black magic ritual. Goya has anthropomorphized four-legged animals for satirical commentary purposes before, starting in Los Caprichos, especially with donkeys, for obvious reasons. The upright posture of the goat figure, though common in other depictions of the devil, in this context could indicate a similar satirical function. Goya also seems to have taken influence from older iconography of ancient gods like Moloch, which could allude to idolatry or cultish behavior. All of this combined with the placement of the Witches' Sabbath painting in his home as across from a depiction of a Christian pilgrimage, not to mention all the other context of his other commentaristic etchings in Los Caprichos, suggests these may be a scathing yet melancholic depiction of Goya angering and grieving over the Spanish leadership. Like the devil in his painting, the Spanish crown was leading the sad, disfigured masses astray, leading them to sacrifice their young to the throne of imperial Catholic Spanish power. I hope you have enjoyed your journey through the land of witches, dear viewer. It has been a pleasure showing you these ghastly works of art. It cannot be overstated how ghastly the reality of witch persecutions were. And these images are simply a reflection of the evil within us. In our next exhibit, we will foray into the vampire's castle. Stay tuned for the next tour.